Welcome back to the Music Talks podcast. If you haven't joined us before, my name is Leon Hill, this is Music Talks, and I am your host. And what a week it has been. We have a great show coming up for you. I got to have a good poke around the famous Premises Studios located in the very trendy London borough of Shoreditch, as well known locally for its award-winning restaurant as it is for hosting everyone from Dave Brubeck and Blur to Lilly Allen and Emily Sande. Viv Broughton, owner of the Premises Studio, was my guide and is the guest on this week's show. But before we hear from Viv, let's just quickly hit some housekeeping. First, a massive thank you so much to everyone that has taken the time to review the show on iTunes. Some very kind words and some awesome 5-star reviews. In these times of algorithm-driven curation, see episode 3, a few kind words and 5 stars count for a massive amount, so please take a moment. Give us some of your feedback and 5 stars. I know, how undignified. Well, while we're being undignified, download and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify. We are now pretty much everywhere. If you can't find us on search, which isn't easy in this tsunami of podcasts that we find ourselves in right now, go to our website. We'll look after you. www.musictalks, all one word, FM. www.musictalks.fm and head to the subscriptions page. But hey, you're listening to this right now, so clearly you know what you're doing. But have you followed our Insta and our Twitter? Oh, you haven't? Well, let me tell you how. We are at Hello Music Talks on both Insta and Twitter. Follow us to find out what and who is coming up and what we think is interesting enough to share with you. Ka-ching! Yes, folks, we're putting the final touches to our Patreon page at the moment. This is our only means of funding. We don't want to carry adverts. To recommend products that we've never heard of or would never use and that you would never buy, we like to be independent and we want to stay that way. So if you like what you hear and you want to hear more, it does cost money. We do have overheads. Get to our Patreon page, www.patreon.com/Music Talks, and make a small contribution. Rewards are going to go up this week, so check back later in the week and see what you could get your hands on. Okay? Thank you. We love you. Finally, are you following our Spotify account? What? You're not? Fire up Spotify now. Punch in Music Talks Podcast and click follow. Excellent. Now you get a blistering new playlist every Friday that accompanies that week's show. Tracks that we name check in the show, plus anything else that our guest is vibing off or wants to share with you, our listener. So let's get down to business. This week on Music Talks, we chat to Viv Broughton. Viv, owner of one of London's best-loved recording studios, digs into the history of the Premises Studios before and after it turned into one of London's favourite independent recording and rehearsal studios. We find out about the world's first solar-powered recording studio, still operating at the Premises and still providing carbon-neutral recording opportunities for artists. We break down Freya Riding's eye-popping 20 grand a month social media spend. Hear about a visit to the Premises from the Empress-like Nina Simone. No machete this time, and yeah, stay tuned for that story. Get to grips with a new tax-efficient way to invest in artists, which enables them to fund the production of their own master recordings, which they then own, and which artist right now isn't talking about ownership of their master recordings. Shout out to Taylor Swift. Viv is a charming and principled man, the kind of guy any industry would benefit from. The music industry especially so. So get on the Premises Twitter, find out more about what's going on over there. But for now, turn on, tune in, listen out for the victorious Viv Broughton.
Music Talks.
Hi Viv, welcome to the show. We're here at the Premises Studio in Hackney in London with Viv Broughton, who is the owner and
CEO and cleaner and toilet unblocker, everything that needs doing.
All-round musical genius.
We do a bit of everything, yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about your journey, how you ended up here? Because I think that's quite interesting in itself before we get on to where we are and why we're here today.
I've always been involved in the music industry since I was a teenager, really. I started out as a drummer.
Okay.
And it's always been on the kind of fringe of the industry. I've always been more fascinated by the fringes of the music industry, where lots of interesting things are happening and new things are developing, rather than the stuff going on at the heart of the business, which tends to be, I don't feel comfortable with it. It's very corporate, and the people in it they're not my kind of people. So I've always, right from the beginning, I got involved in the kind of R&B bands of the 60s. I happened to know somebody who was very close to the Stones as they were starting out in Dartford. And Dick Taylor, who was one of the guitarists in the Stones at that point, decided to leave and start his own band. One of the great career decisions.
Yeah, right. But he didn't regret that.
And so he started a band called the Pretty Things, and I joined as a drummer.
Not entirely unsuccessful.
They did fine. I was with them for about 6 months, and I then and I can't even remember how this happened, but I ended up in a trio with David Bowie and a guy called George Underwood, who was a guitarist, and we had a little band called the Hooker Brothers. So that was early David Bowie career.
Okay.
And we, gigged, and that was like another 6 months. And then there were lots of bands that I was involved with, and Peter Frampton and Alexis Corner, and there were lots of interesting things going on at that time.
Those are all some pretty big names from the
But they weren't
scene.
big then.
No.
They were tiny. The Stones, I used to go and see them every Sunday afternoon at a little club just off Leicester Square. They would play from 2 till 6 every Sunday afternoon in this basement, and they were absolutely incredible. But it wasn't anything big. It was just starting to happen, and it was tremendously exciting.
I bet it was. Rolling Stones playing in a basement for 4 hours of an afternoon.
Yeah.
The time you're talking about, for that kind of music, a lot of those artists, David Bowie, Rolling Stones, a lot of those guys are still out there, still making music. So I think that's sort of testament to the sort of fertility of that period.
To me, it's the early days of any artist's career that's the most interesting. If you watch film biographies of artists, it's the early years that are the most interesting. Not when they're doing the stadiums and the big tours. Then it starts to become less interesting. It's how the thing gelled and formed in the first place, and the early struggles, and living out the back of a transit van and all that kind of stuff. I've always found that exciting, but I've kind of kept moving. I've kind of moved on quite quickly. I was very involved in politics at that time, so I was working as an apprentice as a mechanical engineering apprentice in Woolwich Arsenal. And I'd been expelled from school at 17, and then I started this apprenticeship. And it's a weapons factory. It was run by the War Office then.
Now been turned into flats.
Luxury flats.
Yep.
Beautiful place with a big art centre they're just launching. You'd never have thought it back then.
I bet you wouldn't.
It was the roughest of places. It was really, really, it was like being thrown in at the deep end.
Well, I suppose we're talking about a time when you had the Krays running this part of London.
I didn't know this part of London, but the Krays were very active then. In fact, the first buildings, the premises where they originally started, where these studios started, was in a building that used to house a little nightclub that the Krays owned, which was a couple of doors along from where we are now. And they'd long moved out, and it'd become a minicab office, and then...
If you don't know, Ronnie and Reggie Kray were notorious East London gangsters who grew up on and around the streets of Hackney and Bethnal Green, which at the time were bomb-ravaged and depressed following the Second World War. A place and time when people struggled to find their feet and their place in post-war England, and where only the quick-thinking and fast on their feet found money easy to come by. It was against this backdrop that the Kray twins ran protection rackets, prostitution, dished out beatings, killings, and maintained an iron grip on London's nighttime economy. And in those days, the 1950s and 1960s, we would have been talking late-night drinking dens, illegal gambling clubs, strip clubs and knocking shops, and of course, nightclubs, hosting everyone from Frank Sinatra to notorious lover of rent boys and conservative politician Lord Robert Boothby KBE. The Krays owned and ran nightclubs across London, from the site of what is now the Premises Studio on Hackney Road, Shoreditch, to the curiously named Esmeralda's Barn in Knightsbridge, a short hop, skip and a jump from the famous Harrods department store. But those days of criminals shamelessly operating out of London's nightclubs are long gone, aren't they?
A jazz pianist called Colin Dudman and a bass guitarist called Dill Katz started the Premises Studios just in a couple of rooms.
So when was this?
That would have been in 1986.
Okay.
So it's long before I got involved. So I came along 10 years after that, and they'd been pretty successful. They tried to keep it as a jazz place, and all the current jazz musicians will remember the early days of the Premises. But then, as it started to become successful, bands like Blur and Pulp came along, Suede. Blur, in fact, wrote a song about the Premises, which is on the B side of one of their about the jazzers, because there was always a conflict between the kind of the indie bands who the jazzers would look down their nose at, and there is a story that Colin Dudman went into Blur's rehearsal room and told them off because they were playing out of tune. So they wrote a song about the Premises called Beard, I think it's called. It's on the B-side, one of their singles.
As Viv said, the track Blur wrote with the Premises crew in mind was indeed called Beard, and it was tucked away on a B-side, just like Viv said. But what typically modest Viv didn't tell us was that it was the B-side to one of the band's biggest and most recognisable tracks, the immense Park Life. Both tracks are of course featured on Viv's playlist, which you can find on the Music Talk Spotify account. Back to the chat.
Suede they dug out the basement in the old building in return for studio time. So there were a lot of things like that going on, but they were struggling.
Some people might say that's the best work they've ever done.
May well be. I couldn't possibly comment. But as business people, it didn't run well as a business. They ended up borrowing far too much money and sunk it into a building that they didn't own because they were on the lease.
Oh dear.
And of course, they come to the rent review point and the surveyor goes in to assess the value of the property. And of course, you've done all these improvements. The value accrues to the landlord, and the rents go up fourfold, as a result. So they were in dire financial difficulties. When I came along, they were about to go into bankruptcy, and in fact, they had to go into bankruptcy. There was no escape for them. But it was purely by chance. I was in the cafe because they were already running a cafe there at the time, and talking to the owner, and I said, "How's it all going?" And he said, "Well, terrible, really. We're all going to go bust. So I've got to go into bankruptcy anyway." And I said, "Well, this is awful. Let's see what we can do. So we sat down, and like 2 weeks later, a deal was done, and I was the owner.
Okay, 2 weeks sounds very quick.
It was quick.
How did you put something together like that? Is it from your own personal pocket, sort of altruistic, keep the thing going and try and turn its fortunes around? Did you have other investors that were keen to sort of breathe a bit of life into it?
I had reached a point in my life where I was ready to take on, and I was actually looking for a business to take on. I didn't want to start a new business. I was too old for that. But I wanted to take on a business that was struggling a bit. And I live about 2 minutes walk away. So this was kind of a local place, and I did know it a bit. And it seemed as though it was just right. It was meant to be. I didn't have much money, but I'd just come out of 15 years as marketing director of The Voice newspaper.
Oh, right. Yeah,
and so
The Voice newspaper was founded in 1982 and was, and still is, the only national weekly black newspaper in the UK. Back then, Black Britain didn't have a voice in the media and no one was addressing rising discontent within their communities, culminating in riots in Brixton and set against a feeling of increasing social persecution. This period in the early 80s put the spotlight on what were becoming alienated, disillusioned and discriminated against communities. Opportunities were few and far between if you wanted to read about or report on what was going on back in the home countries of the Voice's target audiences. Fast forward to today, and life is very different on the streets of Brixton. Molotov cocktails have long ago been replaced by flat whites and espresso martinis, and The Voice has proved to be a springboard for young black recording talent and is an award-winning newspaper. Printed every Thursday, The Voice informs and engages communities up and down the country, all in no small measure thanks to Viv and his colleagues at the time.
I had a little bit, probably about 35,000, something like that, to invest. I did try to get other investors interested, but no one was willing to move that quickly. The owner of Miloko had a look, but he was taking too long. And in the end, I just had to take a risk on it and do a deal, mainly to do a deal with the landlord. The landlord was owed about 75,000. So I sat down with the landlord and negotiated, and he ended up getting about 30 grand, whereas he wouldn't have got anything. So it was in his interest to do a deal and a new lease. But of course, then we had to turn the business around because it was in really bad shape. They'd run out of cash basically, so the equipment was falling apart. The musicians and the bands were drifting away, so the income was going down and down. So they were in a downward spiral. So it was about reversing that. So it took a long time, took about 3 or 4 years to turn it around and re-equip it and refurbish and just start building it all back up again.
Well done. I mean, I think it's, testament to what was probably quite a big gamble for you at the time.
It was a crazy gamble looking back on it, and I risked my house on it, so I think I was very fortunate. We put in a lot of work, but I was still very fortunate that it did just suddenly start to take off. We were in the right place here in Shoreditch at the right time, just before all of the explosion of the nighttime economy and the creative industries moving in.
Centre of the hipster universe.
Absolutely. So if we'd been in a different area of London, I'm not sure we'd have made it.
I lived not too far from here for probably 10, 15 years. And I used to take the bus past the Premises Studios every day. And Viv mentioned briefly the cafe. The cafe that's part of this complex, it's open to the public. Amazing food. I probably haven't eaten there for about 8 years, but I still remember. I don't know what it was, but it's like a sort of kebab cooked in yogurt. Tastes fucking amazing. And it is very much a local landmark.
It is. In fact, lots of people think that the Premises is in fact a cafe with a few studios at the back, and that's what it's famous for. Whereas for us, it's, the studios are the main thing. The cafe, we used to run the cafe ourselves right at the beginning, and it was a nightmare because we were hiring musicians and students to work in there who were all giving the food away to their mates and taking it home. It was losing about 1,000 a month, but we felt we had to keep it going because the musicians wanted it. And so after about 3 years, I was looking through Dalton's Weekly, and I saw all these cafes for sale, cafe businesses for sale. And I thought, maybe we can sell that as a going concern, just sell that bit off, not the building itself, but as a going concern. And so we did. So this Turkish brother and sister took it over. So we went from losing 1,000 a month to making 1,000 a month in rent and no headache.
And
they're brilliant at it.
They are. The food's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, it was, and if it's the same
No,
people,
it's
I'm guessing it's
the
still
same
is.
people, and it's brilliant food. Yeah.
Fantastic. You mentioned some of the biggest names in Brit Pop, Blur and Suede. Who else have you had walking through the doors, and who are the sort of bread and butter type clients? Is it still... Do you still have a hardcore of jazz musicians coming in? Is it primarily London-based artists? Where and who comes here?
It's the most extraordinary mixture of people coming through the door. always has been and still is. One of my first memories of taking on the studios was Nina Simone coming in.
Wow.
Which was, one of my absolute idols, and we were terrified because she got a booking. Nina Simone is coming in to rehearse, her tour. And and I'd read all the stories about her, and she was schizophrenic and bipolar, and if you got her on a bad day, she could come at you with a machete. I know friends who've been chased by her with a machete, so it was terrifying, really. But she arrived like an empress, She arrived in a chauffeur-driven limousine, white chauffeur in full livery and hat and everything. She was in a wheelchair. She had because she wasn't very well at that time, she had this incredible grey fur coat from neck to ankles and a huge grey fur hat and these huge dark glasses. And he just wheeled her through, and it was it was the most dramatic. It was a theatrical moment. It was absolutely brilliant.
It sounds like it.
And she was sweet as anything, and she signed a lovely thing, which is Pride of Place in the cafe. So there are people that my idols. I will never forget. An American voice on the phone saying, "I'd like to come in tomorrow. Have you got a room?" And so on. Turned out to be Dave Brubeck, who's like, I bought his albums when I was 18,
Take Five.
Take Five, all of that, And so seeing these people coming and I'd have paid them to come, frankly, just as a footnote. Nina Simone never paid her bill. So I'm very proud to say that on our debtors ledger is Dr. Nina Simone owes whatever it is, £59. And we will just leave it there for posterity.
Yeah, that's probably not a debt you wanted to chase up.
No, not at all. No. And in fact, if she'd written a cheque for us, we wouldn't have cashed it. We would have framed it.
Well, that was a famous thing with, I think, Picasso, wasn't it? He never paid for dinner because no one would cash his checks. That's right.
So, but over the years, I mean, in the last year or so, we've had like Gladys Knight in recording, Tom Jones been in recording, all sorts of people. Like last week we had a big jazz thing, Jason Yard and Sebastian Seb Roachford and people like that. So the jazz people still use this place a lot. Last year's best album in the Jazz FM Awards was Dennis Baptiste's album, and that was recorded here. So we still do lots of jazz, but it's broadened out a lot. What we try to specialise in is highest possible quality at the lowest possible cost. Our rehearsal rooms go out for, well, even the big showcase rehearsal room is only £15 an hour, so which is, I think, one reason why we're so busy every day.
I mean, £15 an hour for people that don't know or aren't musicians. £15 an hour for a large rehearsal space in the centre of London. I mean, that'll get you a railway arch with rats and mice in most places.
Absolutely, yeah. The key to this was buying the freehold of the buildings, which was a tough process. We were originally in, like I said, in these old buildings, 2 or 3 doors away from us, where we are now. And I realised that there's no long-term future. If you're in London, in the centre of London, and you're on a lease, there's no long-term future, especially for studios. That's why so many studios are going out of business, because they come to the end of the lease, or they come to a rent review, the rent goes through the roof, it doubles, triples. Studios can't double and triple their hire rates, so they either have to move a long way out, or they go out of business. So we gradually bought these buildings bit by bit. So the first one I bought at auction, which is 205 Hackney Road, which is a huge building. It's actually the building we're sitting in now. So It goes from Hackney Road all the way down to where the Hells Angels headquarters are next door.
When I arrived at the premises, I was running late, and when I got close to the building, I could see there were a couple of outside broadcast catering trucks parked up at the front doors, the kind of thing you see when a movie or TV show is shooting. There were also a lot of big, hairy guys in very new looking Hell's Angels leather jackets. The lack of engine oil, blood, stale beer and rips on the jackets clearly gave them away. Keen that none of these TV or movie extras made me any later than I already was, I put on my best "don't bother me" face and pushed on through them. What a clown. They could have mopped the floor with me. I didn't realise they were the real McCoy until I asked Viv if they were filming for a UK Sons of Anarchy or something. Viv went on to explain that the cameras were actually there for Rally Ritchie. It was filming at the studios, and if you aren't familiar with this laid-back London rapper, you may know him as the utterly miserable-looking leader of the unsullied Grey Worm of Game of Thrones fame. They've explained that the UK headquarters of the Hells Angels was his next-door neighbour, which might possibly explain why the premises has never been burgled or broken into at any point during its long and illustrious history. And in this part of town, without the Krays to offer protection, that's virtually unheard of. It's also why my exit was far more polite and respectful than my arrival. Coming through!
And it's up for 3 stories. So that came up at auction. So we managed to buy that, just skin of our teeth, cheap, 74,000 if I remember rightly. And this was probably 12-15 years ago, something like that.
That's still cheap for 12, 15. That's
yeah, it was very good. It was very
ago.
Good. The only person who was bidding against me in the auction was the landlord of the place that I was renting for the original premises. And but he dropped out, fortunately. So we did manage to get that, and then that got paid off quite quickly. We were able to use that as collateral to borrow more to buy the other bits, and so the place where we are now has grown organically. There was a point when we'd assembled the site and the ownership of the site, we demolished the whole thing. We put in new foundations, we put in a basement for storage cages for bands, and we built the whole thing back up. But we replicated really what the original premises was like, which is a ramshackle old, looks like old warehouses that have been knocked together. There are little little kind of corridors up and down and ramps, and everybody gets lost in the building, and it's part of the vibe of the place, And I always hated the idea of there's a jazz club called the Vortex, and they had Stoke Newington. It was a fabulous place.
Great cafe as well.
Great cafe, ramshackle, scruffy, but it had this fabulous vibe to it.
Yeah.
And when they got forced out of there, they got the opportunity to rebuild it in Dalston Junction, and they got grants and all the rest of it, and they brought in architects to design. And it was all glass, and it looks and still looks and feels like it's like a school common room or something like that, or a corporate. And the vibe just wasn't there anymore. And I was determined that we wouldn't make that mistake. So we actually kind of designed it to be scruffy and old, and but we were able to build it with high density concrete blocks for soundproofing,
modern materials, conducive to the kind of work you want to do.
And gradually we've added to it, and it's extended, so that we put another floor on the top, which is like 6 producer studios up there. So there are we've got lots of producers and songwriters in the buildings. 24 studios here now.
You have 24 now.
Mixture of rehearsal, recording, long let studios, radio production company here, Folded Wing are based here, and they've got their radio production studio. So it's a mixture of all kinds of things. We've just gradually added to it.
It sounds like you've done a great job, and you're obviously somebody that's very passionate about what you do. And also, given the route you've taken to come here, you're obviously somebody that has some very sort of clear ethical views about how this type of work should be done, whether that's the way that you've done the business or the affordability that you maintain, because musicians aren't rich.
No.
And we don't, we're not in the day and age anymore of 5-album deals and huge advances.
Just in case you have no idea at all, and very quickly for those that do, an advance is a sum of money, in this context, typically paid by a record label or music publisher to an artist. This might be as large as several million, shout out to you Robbie Williams, or maybe just a few £1,000s, shout out to 90% of the recording artists around the world. Now, this payment isn't a gift. Its purpose is to ensure that you, the talented musician, future superstar, can give up your job waiting tables, pulling pints, washing cars, or worse, and concentrate on making great music. No more worrying about paying the rent. Woohoo! Or is there? An advance is exactly that. It's money that you are being advanced against future sales from your music. So it's a loan from the label or the publisher that you repay when you start receiving royalties from sales. And if you don't make any sales, or not enough, what happens then? Well, just like a bank, this loan still has to be repaid, and it's only out of an act of sheer generosity that an unrecouped balance might be written off. Some argue that this system traps the artist into an obligation to continue repaying money and making music until you do, and sometimes these obligations may not be in their best interests to see through. And once the advance is almost paid back, you often find that another one is forthcoming, assuming people are still consuming your music, of course. It's not hard to see how this system could be used in a very controlling way, especially if you felt the label or publisher weren't fully fulfilling their obligations to you. That said, it's equally easy to see how hard, if not impossible, it would have been for many of the talented artists we respect today to have realised their full potential if they were worrying about putting food on the table or having some Trumpian psychopath yell, "You're fired!" advances. Who would have thought giving away money to someone was so problematic?
Absolutely
No.
not.
So there isn't the money sloshing around for people to throw it, sort of recording.
No, everybody's on a budget.
Yeah.
Everybody's on a budget, and we have to work to that kind of budget. Fortunately, we're able to do that because we own the freeholds now, that our rents aren't continuously going up, so we are able to hold the prices down. We're not greedy, we don't need to make a fortune, but it is profitable. I would say this is the busiest arts centre, certainly in East London, in that music is being made here all day, every day, 7 days a week. We don't have any arts grants or subsidies or anything like that. It's completely self-sustaining, and to me it's a model of how art centres should be. I accept in the early days that various like theatres, for instance, I don't see why theatres can't be self-sustaining, and I certainly think venues and all the rest of it, that can be self-sustaining. These kind of big art subsidies, I think, are not that healthy. Every now and again you get kind of councils thinking, oh, why don't we set up rehearsal studios for local kids and so on, and it always ends up being a disaster because, well, for a start, they don't really know what they're doing, but it's set up in such a way that it has to have big subsidies, and so after a while the subsidies get pulled,
and then that amenity disappears.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there any sort of community involvement that you guys have here, sort of over and above making the services available to the local public?
Yeah, we have a charity runs alongside us, music education charity, and we run courses for like jazz piano course, vocal recording workshops. We do voice jams for young people. We do a bit of fundraising for those kind of things. They're sort of one-offs. So there's pretty active music education side to what we do. And the other thing we try to do is, and we've been doing this long before it became fashionable, is to look at the carbon footprint, our carbon footprint. So
Okay.
we built when we came to build the recording studio, or rebuild the recording studio, we tried to make that a model for how an eco studio could be. So it's the first and still, I think, the only fully solar powered professional recording studio in Europe.
Well, I'd like to talk to you about this because my background, and we were talking briefly before we started recording, is when I left the music industry 3-4 years ago, big rock and roll cliche, bought a farm, moved there with partner and young child, and decided we'd be farmers with absolutely no idea of what we were doing at all. The farm was completely off grid, so we had solar power to power everything. We got our water out of the hole in the ground, and we had to manage our own waste, whether that was potato peelings or worse. So I'm interested to hear more about how that studio runs. Is it completely solar powered, or are you balancing your needs from the grid at the same time?
It is completely solar powered. There are 18 large panels on the roof. The way, obviously, you can't have a recording studio, not in this part of the world, that entirely runs just on the panels. The panels are linked to the grid to the national grid. So that at night, obviously, we're sucking from the grid. During the day, daylight today, where it's nice and sunny, it's creating an excess. The excess goes into the grid. And so it is metered in and out, and we generate more than we actually use. To do it any other way would not be practical for a business that has to operate at night. That's the template. We generate more than we actually use. And sometimes we get a check from the electricity company.
This is something sort of close to my heart. And I think as well, to a lot of other people's at the moment, global warming generally is very high on the sort of social and political agenda. One of the things that bugs me is this attitude that, so you don't get enough power from solar, or it takes too long to get your money back from solar, which is complete, in my experience, complete nonsense. The cost of these systems is coming down dramatically. The output is going up. And when you think that there's 66.4 million people in the UK, and every year the UK government subsidises the fossil fuel industry to the tune of £10.5 billion, that's £159.99 for every man, woman and child in this country every year. So when we're filling up our cars with petrol and complaining about the price, just remember you've already paid 160 quid out of your taxes to those petrol companies.
Absolutely.
And so I think when you start to sort of look at these things in context, not just the cost that they have to the environment and the planet that we all have to live on as human beings, but to your pocket, then I think you can start making some more informed calculations about where best to get your energy from. Running a studio like that, is that something you actively market? Is it something that you sort of promote and sell the studio on the back of its green credentials?
Yes, we do, absolutely. It is a selling point, but it can't be the selling point. It's no good to have a solar-powered studio that had crap mics and a desk that crackles. So all artists will want a studio that is up to spec in every possible way. The fact that it is also solar powered is a bonus. Mm-hmm. It means that artists who are often banging on about carbon footprints and the planet and so on can put their money where their mouth is. They can record an album that is carbon neutral, and that is a plus. I think it is an attraction for people, but I passionately believe that the tipping point always comes when it's a no-brainer. The tipping points will come when they've perfected the art of the tiles on the roof as solar panels. The glass in the windows of houses are solar panels, where the batteries can store enough for over 24 hours. Mm-hmm. And the whole thing is cheaper than going on the grid. That means people could all come off the grid one by one. Cars could go the same way. It's about the cost coming down to a point, and it will hit a point where people will say, well, why not? Why wouldn't you? If it's actually cheaper to put your tiles. And I think Elon Musk has perfected the...
Tesla are taking pre-orders now.
Yeah, for the tiles. The tiles are actually cheaper than ordinary tiles. And
stronger as well.
And stronger.
Yeah.
So, our solar panels, we put them in maybe 12 years ago, never touched them once. They work just as well now as the day they were put in. They were quite expensive then. It's a £20,000 system to put in. We did get a government subsidy of 50% at that time, but I believe the unit cost has come down hugely since
I would say the unit cost for solar panels has come down dramatically. When we bought our panels probably 4 years ago, they were 250 watt panels. The same panels now are less than half price, considerably less than half price we paid. That's 3-4 years ago. When we bought those, 250 watt was the highest output you could get. You can now get 500 watt output panels for about £250.
Really?
For that kind of output at that kind of money, we're almost approaching that sort of inflection point where it's like, well, actually, if I sort of do the maths, and yes, the weather's not great in this country, and I can understand the initial resistance, but as you say, when it gets to a point where it is as cheap or cheaper, I think we will see people switch. Obviously, in my mind, the criminal thing is the size of the subsidies to fossil fuel companies in this country. It's the highest value subsidy across Europe, by the way. The flip side is we're not subsidising renewables at all. We've withdrawn grants for solar and renewable energy. We've withdrawn the feed-in tariff, which, as Viv mentioned, is the payments you get from the energy company for putting your excess back into the grid. So at the moment, there is zero financial incentive or subsidy to make this change. And I think that probably speaks volumes about the ties that government has to the oil industry and fossil fuel companies in general.
Most definitely. And I think it will gradually change. There's lots of pressure, obviously. I think the environmental movement, the Extinction Rebellion people, I think if they started to focus in more on things like this, which is the practical solution, then that is the thing that's going to make the difference. I mean, even things like LED bulbs, for instance, they've slashed we put them in early on, and although they're expensive in the first instance to install, once they're in, they're slashing your electricity bill by 90% in some cases. Now, if that's multiplied up in every household and every business across the country, that's a fantastic reduction in the use of electricity, and there's no reason why that can't keep going. The same just needs to happen with other things. I always thought we were in a unique position to demonstrate that it's possible, and that it could work. And the other side of all of that was we didn't just put in the solar panels, we built the whole of the recording studio with recycled and reclaimed materials. So in the main recording room, the floor, which is 4 feet thick, it has a subfloor of 150 old car tyres.
Wow.
And then it's layered up with reclaimed plasterboard and all, various layers and layers to create this kind of soundboard. Hidden away underneath are all these old car tyres, filled with old rock wool.
Yeah.
Every door in this building came from salvage. Most of the large windows in the recording studio, the big kind of picture plate glass windows, I got from salvage. This was armoured glass in a steel frame, huge windows, and they were going for £100 each. If you had them made, you'd be probably £1,500 each. I'm mean. I'm tight with my money, and it's one reason why we managed to survive, because most people starting out in building a studio are going to go, we'll get the guys in who do studio doors, and they're going to charge you £600 a door. I got doors for £50 each from salvage, and they are high quality doors because they've all come out of the banks and the offices in the city who paid £600 in the first place for these. 5 years later decided they want to refurbish the whole place. The salvage firms pull these doors out and they sell them on for 50 quid each. So, it's no brainer. Unfortunately, the salvage company's gone out of business now, so I can't get them anymore. But that's basically how the financial incentive to do something coincides with the opportunity to reuse and recycle stuff and to operate in an eco-friendly way.
Yeah, and I think when you sit there and sort of put it that way, well, first of all, it seems obvious, and secondly, it demonstrates that it's not that difficult to build what is effectively a world-class recording studio from environmentally friendly products and recycled, upcycled products as well. Sure. And there's no reason why that needs to be restricted to a recording studio. You could apply that to pretty much any business and pretty much any home.
Of course. Of course you can. I mean, there's a window up in the recording studio, which is a beautiful bronze window. It's circular, made out of solid bronze, and it came out of a bank in the city. And again, I got it for £60. I mean, the raw bronze alone would have been worth 10 times that. So, and it's a feature.
I was going to say, and that kind of thing adds to the look and feel of the place.
Sure. Absolutely, it does. Yeah. And people are fascinated by it. So it's a living demonstration of what's possible.
Any future plans for the premises?
Well, we've reached the limit of where we can expand physically, just out of space. We now have the whole of this block. So we are developing one part of it, which we're waiting on planning consent for, which will be an extension to the cafe, so more of a bar cafe with a bit of a live music area. So that's one thing we're doing, working on slowly.
A venue?
Like a little venue, like a kind of piano bar, come little jazz thing, or singer-songwriter, singers' nights, that kind of thing. A little bit of live music. That's a long-term plan. Currently, one of the things I'm working on, and I'm a great believer in, is developing a new business model for artists. I've always thought, I've watched this process all my life where young artists, hugely talented, come along, they do a few demos, they go to a record company, they go to Sony, go to Warner's, they go to Universal, whatever, with their demo. If they are lucky, in inverted commas, they get signed. They're given 8%, 9% royalty rate. Their masters are then owned by the major company, and it's feudal. It's like, it's a serf-master relationship, and it still goes on. I cannot believe that it still goes on. So the business model that I've been working on is for the artists to form themselves into a limited company right from the word go, to raise working capital by selling shares into their company via the SEIS scheme, if you know the SEIS scheme, which is a government HMRC. It's a government approved investment scheme.
Okay, HMRC is, of course, the
Inland Revenue, the tax people, the tax man. So the tax man have got this approved system where if somebody invests in a startup company, they are immediately entitled to a 50% tax relief on whatever they put in, provided it's a company that qualifies. SEIS is Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme. So the artist forms themselves into a limited company, registers with HMRC, with the taxman, under this scheme, gets the pre-approval notice from them, and then can sell shares. So you can raise up to 150,000 under this scheme. Let's say someone comes along who is willing to invest in an artist, willing to invest, let's say, £10,000. The investor gets 5,000 back straight away in tax relief. If, as might possibly be the case, the artist doesn't make it as big as, and the company goes down the pan, the investor gets a further 28% back in tax relief. So their risk actually is tiny.
22% on their initial 22%.
Investment. So they've risked £2,200 out of their 10,000. On the other side of the equation, if the artist takes off and becomes Adele, a Bowie, or whatever it is, a major artist, and starts earning large sums of money, then the investor, as obviously the value of their share will shoot up. After 3 years, they can sell their shares, and there is no capital gains tax on it. So this is hugely attractive for investors.
Right, yeah, I can imagine.
However, you are investing in a music artist. So it's a big gamble. It's a punt. But
the risks have been fairly well mitigated.
Absolutely. And I think it's a no-brainer. So I'm working with an artist at the moment, and we're going through this process. That allows the artist then to record their album or whatever they want to record, an EP or whatever it is. They will own, their company owns all the masters, owns all the copyrights, all the intellectual property
And they would
rights.
then, I guess,
They do licensing deals. So if Universal come along and want to sign this person, this artist, because their tracks are so good, it's a licensing deal.
And they're not owning the masters.
And
they've just got the rights to use them for a period.
Absolutely. And the same with the song copyrights. They're all owned by the artist company. And so it's a collection deal, or it's whatever kind of deal you do with the publisher. Mm-hmm. The copyrights remain within the artist company. And I think it's the way the industry has to go. It's a personal kind of ambition of mine. I want to see one artist at least get a breakthrough under this business model, using this business model, because I think that will open the doors to other artists will want to do it. We'll see that it can work this way, but also, even more important, investors will look at it and go, okay, I'll put 10 grand in here, I'll put 50 grand in here, because it works, you know. And it becomes, again, a no-brainer. In that way, you kind of open up a whole new raft of possibilities for the way this particular industry works, you know.
You talk about sort of needing the interest of investors. There's a huge amount of investment coming into the industry from all directions, whether that's big, banks making investments in publishing catalogues, whether it's in additional services, artist services, label services. There's a lot of these businesses springing up, and a lot of them are getting or very attractive to outside investment, because the way that we consume music is changing, and there is now money in the industry. And I think it's not a prerequisite that you have a traditional record label deal to earn money. You can do it outside of that paradigm by putting music out yourself. You will earn equal, if not better, royalties through some of the aggregation platforms, Spotify, SoundCloud. These work on a kind of parity level. Will give you what you would be earning from a record label. I think these things they're not only becoming feasible, they're potentially more attractive. And I think it's a great time to be doing something like that.
I'm sure it is, and I think what the majors bring to the table is money, is cash, and it is expensive to run social media marketing campaigns and that kind of thing. You do need to spend money. I mean, I heard the other day that Freya Ridings were spending $20,000 a month on social media promotion.
20G a month? Let's try and put that social media spend into context. If you don't know her by now, really, what stone have you been reclining under? Freya Ridings was the breakout artist of 2018, a hugely talented woman that writes and performs all her own music. Met with massive critical acclaim and success throughout 2018 and into 2019, Freya's top 10 hit Lost Without You has smashed through the 100 million streams mark. In fact, it's about to break the 100 million streams mark on Spotify alone. Now, this is very difficult to calculate, as there are a lot of moving parts to consider when trying to find a figure to work with. So to start, let's focus on the recording deal rather than the publishing. If we assume that Freya has a standard artist deal and her label didn't do too bad a job of negotiating their streaming licenses, she's probably grossing circa 0.007 cents per stream. Now, a spend of $20,000 a month at 0.007 cents per stream would take 2,857,143 streams to recoup. If we just take the number of streams for Lost Without You on Spotify, so revenue from a single track on a single platform, that would easily cover a social media spend of $20,000 a month every month for the whole of 2019 and the whole of 2018. Now, have a think for a minute. If Freya writes all her own material, then she's not only getting a fat check from her record label, but she's also getting a fat one from a publisher and a fat one from her performance royalties. She's banking all three herself. Triple threat recording artist right there. Whether you think it's money well spent or not, she can clearly afford it, and it must be paying dividends. Freya's playing the UK and the West Coast US throughout the summer and into autumn. Get a ticket if you can.
There is so much music being uploaded every single hour.
40,000 tracks a day to Spotify at the moment.
That's right.
10,000 tracks a week to Beatport.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Spotify at the moment, their catalogue of tracks is probably bouncing between 70 and 80 million tracks on the service. SoundCloud, however, when I was working with them, 3 or 4 years ago, they had 100 million audio tracks, which it's obviously a slightly different model to Spotify, but yeah, huge amount of music at the moment.
Sure. Well, that is the challenge for an independent artist. I do believe artists should be independent,
cutting through the noise and being heard.
Yeah, you've got to still engage with the big boys somehow, But if you can engage with the big boys on the basis that you're licensing tracks to them, you're not giving away your masters, your copyrights, then you are in a much better long-term position.
Is this kind of initiative, the SEIS scheme, something that you're talking to any managers about?
The way that I think this business model can work is that we can work with an artist to get them up to that point where they need then management, good management. And then to engage with managers who will then have the opportunity, and it's it's an absolute gift on a plate in a way, because the album will have been made to a very high standard. We're at the sort of front end of things, and that's where I enjoy being, finding new artists, seeing new artists come through and seeing them move on to greater things. People like Lilly Allen were here for a long, long time, and then we saw her go off and do stuff. Emily Sande kind of almost lived here when she came down from Scotland, and now she's off and doing things. She still comes back a lot. So that's, to me, the exciting end of the business. But it's still, and I find it frustrating to see artists going and signing deals that are still awful deals, really. Just because they're desperate, they just want the break. So they sign anything, and it's back to almost like the 1940s where, a big guy turns up in a car with a cigar and says, "Come with me, kid, I'll make you a star, just sign here." It's a cliche. And it's still going on.
It does. And you're right, there's still a surprising number of people that will do whatever it takes to get that record deal. Now,
and then regret it and be, 4 years later, they're fighting with lawyers to get out of it.
Yeah, and when they do get out of it, they realise that they don't own their music.
No, exactly.
So they're starting again from scratch.
Absolutely. So we're trying to avoid that. I think there is a way to do it.
I think what's also worth mentioning, and you alluded to the fact that a lot of the companies we're talking about are based in West London. We're on the other side of the city. We're in Hackney, we're in East London. This area is synonymous with the rise of a particular urban music, grime. We've got some big breakout international stars coming out of that scene. And these guys, I think, are super interesting, very exciting, very edgy, but they flip it on its head. These guys are making their own music. They're putting it out through distribution channels that are available to everybody online. They're developing their own communities around their music. Some of those are less positive than others, but that speaks more to the backgrounds and communities that these guys come from and are living with day to day. They're managing their own businesses. They're bringing merchandising in. They're deliberately not doing record deals, some of them. They're doing it well. They're making money. Are you seeing much of, or any of these types of artists come through using a facility like this?
Yeah, we do. We've got like Riley Ritchie in today, filming for his next project, and there's lots of young guys coming up through.
I like him.
There's a local project called Grime Pays, which is it evolved from a bunch of young guys on the local estate just around the corner, and we've worked with them a bit. I had one of the funniest scenes that I wish I could have got on film, and it was incredibly sweet because these are kids who are kind of on the fringe of gang life, and
some of them not on the fringe,
and some are further in. And they came in and they recorded some stuff, and we helped with the recording. And so they made these hardcore kind of grime tracks and rap tracks, And they wanted to do a showcase. They work with a little local kind of organisation called Grime Pays, who are also helping them get along. So they wanted to do this showcase. So we put them in Studio One, and the local church invited loads of people. And there's a convent just around the corner from here.
Such a weird juxtaposition, isn't it?
It was,
the communities these kids come from in church.
So 4 of these nuns came from the convent, who sat in the front row, and they were about 85 years old. The guys did their performance kind of on the little stage, 10 feet from them, effing and blinding, crotch grabbing, the whole performance. And they were completely just in their element. And these nuns were just like lapping out. They were so excited. It was the weirdest juxtaposition of audience and performer I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And I'd love to have got it on film. But
were they filming it?
No, unfortunately not. But they're very keen to keep their own places, which is great. It's independent, so I'm all for independence.
Agreed.
And if they can find ways to do it like that, fantastic. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we were speaking to Gregor Pryor, who's a fairly well-respected industry lawyer, and he mentioned a quote of Jay-Z's: "I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman." And I think these guys embody that philosophy. Whether it's the way that they record their music, whether it's the way that they manage their businesses, I think it's really exciting. It's really interesting. I think it's always more interesting to look around the periphery.
Yeah, look to the fringes. I always look at the fringes. I think the fringes is where the interest is. The thing I worry about with the grime guys is a bit like the punk movement. It's kind of just get on and do it, get on a stage and do it. It's that kind of thing. But if they don't have some kind of structure of their own, they will also get co-opted and colonized really by the industry. So in the punk, the big names got signed by the big companies and the whole thing kind of changed. I think that's happening with grime too.
I think it's happened with hip hop. When you look at sort of sales, I mean, hip hop's become the new pop music, really. And when you go back to the early 80s, when it was sort of starting out in New York, it was a very different proposition. And then it moved through several different guises until it became arguably sufficiently sanitized. We don't get these records being banned anymore from airplay. The parental restriction stickers are a lot smaller, and the sales are a lot higher. And you've got people like Jay-Z, arguably again has a background on the peripheries of sort of gangs and that world, becoming president of Def Jam Records. So yeah, I think that you're probably right. Longevity may well be dependent on, sort of assimilating to some degree and sanitizing your offering a little bit.
What I think is interesting though is that, I was looking at like who was the biggest selling artist of 2018, and it was someone I'd never heard of, Post Malone. Managed by a guy from Hackney.
He was the biggest
selling artist, more than Drake, more than Jay-Z, more than Beyonce. They started out as the two of them together, two guys basically, a manager and the artist, and just built this up themselves. I don't know what their deals are now, but whatever deals they would have ended up doing, they are dealing from a position of strength and not from a position of weakness. So that is the important thing, whether you're structured as a limited company or whether you're a gang. If you're in a position of weakness and you've got 15 major labels trying to sign you, then if you've got a good lawyer, you should be able to sort the deal out in a way that, going to stand you in good stead in later life.
This is the thing, it's leverage in those negotiations. I think a lot of artists, they may well have sort of earned their chops. They may well be a fantastic musician, very tight, great songwriter. They think that's sufficient leverage to get a good deal when they're having these conversations, but it isn't. You need to have built yourself up to a particular point where whoever it is you're dealing with, publisher, label, etc., is looking at you and thinking, okay, this is going to take very little investment. They're already bringing money in. Again, we're talking about mitigating risks, in essence. And I think if you're in a position where you can get to that stage, good luck to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's about, as the industry changes, and it is a rapidly changing industry, and that's one of the things that's always been exciting about the music business. Someone can go from being completely unheard of one day to within almost months being the name on everybody's lips. And that volatility and that fluidity of the industry is what makes it exciting. That the doors are always, there isn't always new people coming through all the time. The doors are open. You can get a breakthrough, and there isn't an industry that feeds off of new, unusual, different stuff, fresh things, It's voracious in that way, that it needs fresh meat all the time. It
is.
But it does mean that it's not like any other industry. It does mean you've got a chance, which is why it attracts so many, young people to it, looking for a break, But it's hard. It's as hard now as it's ever been to get a break. The best ones will rise to the surface, as they always have done.
Yeah.
I remember the Stones couldn't get signed by anybody. It was just like what's this long-haired weird sound racket going on, and they were the coming thing. So.
Look at them now.
Yeah, I remember Bowie. Bowie didn't get it at all. You know, he was way behind the loop on the rise of the kind of R&B bands of the 60s, the Stones and the Yardbirds and bands like that. He was in a covers band. He was doing covers of the pop hits of that time, and he saw how the wind was blowing, and then decided he needed to get into that. But we kind of regarded him as being somebody who didn't quite get it, who was slightly behind the loop, you know, and who had to do a bit of catching up to and if you know much about his early career, it's lots of false steps.
And went through lots of different guises.
Of different guises. He went through the mime thing with Lindsay Kemp. He went through the Anthony Newley thing, the Laughing Gnome. Ridiculous stuff. Until he found Tony Visconti, and then, you know,
got it with Ziggy Stardust.
Fell into place, you know, but it could just as easily have gone the other way.
Listen, Viv, it's been great talking to you.
A pleasure.
I'm conscious of time. We've been going for a decent
It was a lot
hour.
of fun. A lot of fun.
You know, we'd like to come back and talk to you another time and sort of see how things are going here. But thank you for your time this morning.
Anytime you like.
Thank you.
Music talks.
Well, what a lovely guy, didn't I tell you? I hope that you found that as interesting as I did. Nina Simone, Machete, who knew? After we finished chatting, Viv took me for a tour of the studios, and he was right. It's a rabbit warren of corridors and stairs, of nooks and crannies, and some fantastic state-of-the-art gear. Amazing place and full of character, and their largest rehearsal room is only £15 an hour. Still can't get over that. Thanks to Viv, and shouts to all the team at the Premises Studios. Remember, if you liked what you heard, subscribe, like, review. Get to www.musictalks.fm to subscribe through your favourite podcast provider. We now have links to pretty much all of them. Check the Spotify playlist that accompanies this episode and all other episodes. Our Twitter and Insta is @HelloMusicTalks, and you can email us at hellomusictalks@gmail.com. Thanks to the backroom team, Rachel and Mia, and huge props to the beautiful Brutal Deluxe for our lovely theme music and the audio that you hear throughout the shows. As ever, you've been listening to Music Talks. I'm Leon Hill. This has been a Music Talks production, and we're out of here like we're being chased by a fur coat wearing, machete wielding empress.